Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our discussion tonight on sustainability, environmentalism, and everything climate politics. My name is Sarah Pelhees, and I am one of the co-presidents of Green Hope, our environmental student org here on campus. We are the ones who helped coordinate this event for tonight alongside Student Congress. So basically, what's happening tonight is we are going to have Dr. Jules Hoppin. He's going to do basically a little mini lecture going through the sustainability platforms of both the Biden-Harris ticket and the Trump-Pence ticket, just so we can all be a little bit better informed citizens. And then all the students behind me are going to go through a little bit of a student perspectives panel on climate politics, and we're going to dive deep into the Green New Deal, environmental justice, fossil fuels, climate change, all the good stuff. So, without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic off to Dr. Jules Hoppin and start the night off. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah and Zach and Green Hope, for caring about these issues and doing the work to put this event on. And thank you to Gretel and Megan and Liam also, who we'll hear from shortly. And so, as Sarah had said, I wanted to just lay out some basics about the campaign as it relates to climate change, environmental policies, et cetera. And then we'll pass it along and have some conversation and discussion about these important issues. The election, of course, voting day, I should say, or election day is coming up in less than 2 weeks, and more than 40 million some folks have already cast their vote. So this is, I think, most important for people maybe who haven't made up their minds yet and haven't decided perhaps for whom to vote. When it comes to the environment and environmental policies, environmental plans, the choice is fairly clear. Most analysts and experts agree that there are significant differences between the two major party candidates, and so that makes it a bit easier for us to assess these positions and kind of make some sense of it all. And so I wanted to begin by borrowing from the Wall Street Journal and their summary of the difference between the candidates. And so here we go. The 2020 presidential election pits one candidate making climate change integral throughout his platform against another who dismisses its importance and pledges to keep pushing a deregulatory agenda. Environmental policy is one of the biggest contrasts between Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden. Energy companies, automakers, unions, and others all may see significant changes if there is a turnover in the White House. Mr. Biden has called climate change an urgent crisis and has proposed the most aggressive climate agenda of any major party candidate thus far, according to many analysts. He proposes to marshal vast government resources, up something like $2 trillion in spending over 4 years, to make environmental policy and climate change a driving force in decisions on the economy, infrastructure, transportation, social justice, foreign relations, and other matters as well. Mr. Trump has challenged the science documenting global warming and climate change, and he's cast Mr. Biden's strategy as a threat to U.S. businesses. He vows to restrain the government influence. Mr. Biden wants to expand his campaign's second-term agenda. Doesn't mention climate specifically, but he does list clean air and water broadly as being priorities. And so we have a clear difference here. For President Trump, he is consistent with the traditional Republican position that efforts to, from the left particularly, efforts from Democrats to protect the environment, whether it's climate or whether it's endangered species or clean air, water, that these efforts often entail significant economic costs. And not only that there are entail costs that come from taxpayer dollars, but also costs in terms of limiting economic prosperity, limiting economic growth, making it more difficult for companies, for corporations, for businesses to be in business and to advance profits and economic prosperity. Mr. Biden, former Vice President Biden, on the other hand, particularly with his ambitious climate change plan, is convinced or expresses the conviction that there is not a major conflict between the economy on one hand and the environment on the other. And he suggests that through this significant $2 trillion investment in new technologies and green technologies, that can be a stimulant to economic growth and prosperity. So good paying jobs will be the result, and in the long run argues that money will be saved due to preventing health problems that may come from breathing unclean air, or the economic impacts that come from fires or storms or droughts or other environmental impacts. And so I wanted to just outline a little bit about the Biden plan and then contrast it to what we've seen with the Trump administration. So it's when Vice President or former Vice President Biden was running for the Democratic nomination, he was pitching himself as a moderate and did not adopt the more radical or more aggressive or ambitious climate plans as some of the other candidates, including the vice presidential candidate, Kamala Harris. So, but since then, over the summer, Mr. Biden has extended his plan and come up with this fairly ambitious $2 trillion plan. Now, President Trump and others have attacked the plan as being essentially the Green New Deal, that it is as ambitious, it is as potentially dangerous or costly as that plan. And the truth of the matter is it doesn't quite go that far. I have some specific examples if we want to get to that. So he is moved more to the progressive wing of the party as it comes to an ambitious climate change plan, but not embracing the Green New Deal, as it's called. And so significant aspects of the plan are to, as it relates to the electric or power sector of the economy, the plan is to become carbon neutral by the year 2035. And then for the entire economy, for the U.S. economy, that there would be a net zero emissions by the year 2050. Some of the interesting aspects of it that would not be consistent with the most progressive wings of the Democratic Party would be not necessarily an embrace of nuclear power, of nuclear energy, but a recognition that nuclear power has a significant role to play in producing clean energy, unlike fossil fuels. And then also somewhat controversial is the position, Biden's position on fracking. The president has indicated that that Biden is against all fracking and wants to outlaw fracking. Former Vice President Biden says that that is not the case, and that he intends instead to limit new oil and gas drilling permits on federal lands. So there's some disagreement on that issue of what would happen to fracking in a potential Biden administration. The president, over the past 4 years, has been encouraging in words and in policy actions of the traditional fossil fuel industries, oil, natural gas, and also coal, somewhat less successfully when it comes to coal, and has expressed an intention to continue with those types of programs. Perhaps more controversial has been the president's decision to withdraw the United States from the Paris Climate Change Treaty or deal. It's a non-binding agreement. And actually, as the treaty was written, there's a period, a waiting period, essentially, before a country is allowed to withdraw from the agreement. And that day comes November 4th, the day after the election, coincidentally. And so former Vice President Biden has indicated the intention to rejoin the treaty, and not just rejoin in terms of participation, but also to try to restore, from his perspective, the U.S. position of leadership when it comes to issues related to climate and environmentalism. Also, an important distinction is the Trump administration's consistent position on deregulation. And this hasn't been deregulation not just related to the environment, issues related to the environment, but generally. And so some 100 different regulations that the Trump administration has rolled back in terms of endangered species, in terms of clean water or clean air, or in terms of methane emissions coming from fossil fuel generation. And so the argument that President Trump has made and his supporters and the administration is that this deregulation has been very important in terms of allowing for economic growth and to stimulate economic activity, and particularly in the energy sector. And so especially before the onset of COVID, the significant health disaster that it has turned out to be, but also the economics. And so the president is correct when he points to a relatively healthy economy, economic growth, low unemployment rates before the onset of the COVID-19. And so what explains this? In part, a significant tax reduction, and then also this deregulation effort. And it's been fairly significant under the Trump administration. And so we would expect that to continue if Trump wins, and if Biden wins, we would likely see a reimposition of those regulations that many Trump supporters and Republicans see as onerous and coming at the cost or the expense of business and of companies. So we have a clear difference, and what's interesting also is that the differences between the candidates reflect in large part the differences that we see throughout the parties, the Republican and Democratic Party. In some ways, President Trump has diverged from traditional Republican policies, thinking about trade particularly. But when it comes to deregulation, we see a consistency there. And also a doubting, or maybe not a doubting, but a lack of recognition that the climate change crisis is in fact a crisis. Recent public opinion polling shows that since 2010, the number of Americans who think that climate change is a major threat to the well-being of the United States has risen from 44% in 2010 to today in 2020, we see 60% of Americans identifying climate change as a major threat. So there's been an increase in Americans taking this, considering it to be so serious. Former Vice President Biden has even referred to it as an emergency, the issue of climate change. But this switch has been largely among the Democratic Party, among Democratic voters, who in 2010, 61% of Democrats, or lean Democrats, considered a major threat, and that has increased in the 10 years to 88% of Democrats, so a nearly unanimous position there, where Republicans have increased a bit from 25% up to 31%. And much of that growth of those in the Republican Party who consider this a major threat to the United States has come from younger Republicans and a younger demographic. So I'm going to leave it at that. I have a lot more material that we could go through, but I'm sure we all would like to hear from our student panelists, who I believe are going to introduce themselves and then tell us a little bit about why they wanted to join in this conversation and consider this a significant issue. So Gretel, please.
Hi, I'm Gretel Weller. I'm the Vice President of Hope College Republicans, and I was interested in joining today because the environment is very essential to some of my favorite hobbies. I love hunting, fishing, and I'm very involved with agriculture, and yeah, the environment's essential to that. So I enjoy looking at the relationship between environment and economics.
Hi, I'm Megan Mead. I'm from Vox Populi, Hope's nonpartisan group, and I am here because I believe sustainability practices and environmental policy are going to be essential to the future of our country and the world.
Hi, I'm Liam Deepice. I'm the treasurer for Hope Democrats. I joined this panel because climate change and environmentalism are issues very important to me as someone who loves nature and also would like a livable planet in the future. And I thought this would be a good opportunity to share my thoughts on this concerning the election.
Okay, thank you all. The first question I'd like to pose is, I suppose, pretty straightforward. How big of a deal is climate change, do you think? We saw Supreme Court Justice nominee Amy Coney Barrett in hearings recently suggests that indicate that this is a controversial topic. There's much debate. Some on the left, and certainly candidate Biden, would say no, it's more than that. It's actually an emergency, and would contend that the science, at least from his view, is pretty clear on the dangers that are posed to the United States, but to the whole planet in terms of climate change. So, how big of a deal is it, do you think?
I would say that the importance placed on climate change definitely depends on what generation you're a part of. Among older generations, it might be more of a debate as to whether or not it actually is real. And amongst younger generations, the debate seems to be more as what's the best way to deal with this? Is it through regulation or letting the market do its work?
I first would like to start with just a piece of data from the Pew Research Center. 42% of registered voters today say that climate change is very important to their vote. While that's not a majority, it's pretty close. So to most Americans, climate change is very important, and to 42%, it's very important to their vote as well, which is kind of going to be crucial in this election.
I think climate change is going to be one of, if not the most, or should be the most important issue in this election and also politics going forward. The science is very clear on the fact that climate change is real, it's human-caused, and it's an existential threat to humanity. And we hear that a lot, but it helps to understand what that really means. We've seen its effects already in terms of the wildfires hitting the West Coast, also Australia earlier in the year, and the Amazon rainforest continually. Those and other natural disasters like hurricanes and droughts are only going to get worse and more frequent as climate change becomes more severe. Also, the issue of climate change intersects heavily with other issues like immigration and systemic racism, such as droughts causing people to relocate and emigrate to other countries, including the United States, or with racism in areas like disaster response, as we saw with Hurricane Katrina, or environmental racism like pollution disproportionately affecting Black and brown communities. All
right, thank you all. So I thought, Gretel, there's an important point, a couple of points that you made, that the generational gap that we see and particularly perhaps within the more within the Republican Party, where Democrats seem to be more unified in terms of the seriousness of climate change. But yes, it strikes me that it's very important on, Republicans and Democrats disagree, obviously, on policy options when they agree on the assessment of the problem. So, for example, if the problem is crime, or the problem is the need for improved education, that where kind of both parties generally agree that this is an issue that needs to be addressed, and then they disagree on how to address it. And they have different policy prescriptions, different policy ideas. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. One of the questions that the organizers have put together beforehand has to do with so-called cap and trade ideas, or to try to somehow have economic or market-based approaches to addressing climate change. I wonder if you, Gretel, could start on that, and then we'll hear from the others as well.
Yeah, definitely. So going further into the carbon tax, I would say that it does have the potential to work, but there are alternatives to reduce emissions that won't drive industry out of the US. There's a real power in tax avoidance, and it frequently pushes companies to countries with little regulation and low tax rates. These countries don't have the resources to deal with the environmental problems that are brought by these companies, and shipping our carbon emissions to other countries doesn't fix the problem. It gives it to others less equipped to deal with it. To avoid industry moving to escape taxes, a carbon tax would need to be globally implemented at the same rate, and it's not practical for this to be done in developing countries. An alternative to this that I find very interesting is a program called the Pollution Rights Auction. This is where governments set an acceptable level of pollution and auctions off the rights for companies to pollute. As bidding increases, firms weigh their options and determine if they can find less expensive alternatives to pollution. This allows firms to have choice, which makes them less likely to leave the US for other countries less equipped to deal with their pollution. And it's not to say that these firms want to pollute, but it's costly not to do so. By auctioning off these rights, it allows firms to use innovative solutions created in the free market to reduce carbon emissions.
I also agree that carbon taxing can be a problem with businesses moving out of the United States. But I think the more developed countries do have a duty to try to put in those regulations and at least bring carbon emissions down globally, even if that costs some money. But another problem with this could also be the businesses. A lot of big businesses influence politics today, so passing carbon taxing would also be hard within the government, because political donors often have a lot of weight in the policies that politicians do implement.
Okay. Well, I don't think carbon taxing is a bad idea. I think it's a good idea. With a crisis like climate change, as serious as it is, we need an all-hands-on-deck approach, and carbon taxes are definitely a useful tool for reducing emissions because it's an example of true cost pricing. So, for example, if you go and you fill up your car's gas tank at a gas station, you're paying for the gas, which covers the cost of extracting the petroleum, refining it, and keeping the oil company alive. But what that cost doesn't account for is all of the damage that that carbon pollution will cause down the road in terms of natural disasters and air pollution and things like that. But with a carbon tax, it artificially includes those costs in fossil fuel costs. So then it will discourage buying those fuels, whether it's taxing it at the point of sale at a gas station or at the point of production at a refinery or where it's extracted from the ground.
So it seems to be the case that there's some agreement, at least, on the notion that incentives are a good idea, right? To not just make restrictions or write rules or, pass laws saying you can't do this or you can't do this or you have to do this, say, towards maybe automobile manufacturers, but that the government, through a variety of means, can provide incentives and economic incentives to incentivize behavior that is friendlier to the environment. And so I wonder, including, for example, tax cuts for if I buy an electric vehicle, should I get a tax cut from the government? Should the government be involved in incentivizing that type of purchasing behavior? Or even on the producer side, that the government would perhaps provide tax breaks or other incentives for companies that increase the number of electric vehicles that they produce, as one example. And Gretel, I don't mean to put you on the spot first all the time, so if others if we want to switch it around a little bit, the order, you can do that.
Okay, yeah, that works.
Sorry, Liam.
Okay, what's specifically your question?
Yeah, I'm just talking about, thinking about, in the carbon taxing or whatever language we use, is one way of using economic incentives, and sometimes these are market-based. We call these market-based approaches. But in terms of the government maybe having a heavy hand, that maybe, folks who are more libertarian or, free market conservatives who don't want a huge government involvement in the economy and don't want the government to try to legislate spending patterns, how we spend our money. But is it appropriate for the government to say, well, we have a crisis here and it's appropriate for the government to provide a big tax cut for people who would decide to purchase an electric vehicle versus people who decide to purchase a gasoline-powered vehicle?
Yeah, absolutely, it's appropriate. Like taxes are a great tool for discouraging people from purchasing more fossil fuels. Tax cuts for things like renewable energy, renewables manufacturing, and things like that can also be a good tool.
I also think that probably tax cuts for corporations who, like you said, build more like sustainable cars or manufacture more sustainable products. I feel like that's probably a better way to go about it, because the corporations will be able to kind of make the market that way more sustainable, and then people will be inclined to buy those because there's more of them, and then they'll be cheaper with the whole supply and demand thing.
I would agree that tax cuts could be a good way to get things heading in the right direction, but I would fall more into that group of less government intervention in the market and letting competition drive the market. Competition provides great incentives for companies to cut costs, increase efficiency, and find innovative ways to create more sustainable solutions. We see just today that GMC announced an entirely battery-powered truck, and that's not done just through the government telling them they have to. They're finding ways to come up with a solution for things that people want.
Excellent. Yes, and that it gets back to that first point, or one of the first points that we talked about in terms of appealing to the market. And if consumers want to buy electric vehicles, then how the free market works, the manufacturers will supply those the vehicles that people are interested in buying. But I wonder if that gets back to this issue, though. If you have significant amount of the population who doesn't recognize that there is a problem, that at what point is the government has a role, maybe not in demanding that people take certain positions, or that demanding that people you spend their own money in particular ways, but an educational function or an educational role. So if you were, say, inclined to, not take climate change quite seriously, and then you have not just President Trump, but Republicans in the U.S. Senate, James Inhofe, maybe Tom Cotton, belittling the concern, or bringing a snowball on the floor of the Congress to indicate, well, we still have snow, this is not real, that this is some sort of a hoax. So, not maybe a government that is, so heavy-handed, but a leader or a leadership that wants to educate and inform the citizens about what the realities are.
Yeah.
And anyone, go ahead. Megan.
I think, yeah, not too much government control, but then again, obviously, I support free market trade and all that, but it's not going fast enough. The competition isn't working well enough to create sustainable solutions. We're still going to reach a point where climate change is going to be extremely detrimental to the world before the competition is able to catch up, just at the rate it's going. And so I think that the government does need to play a role in that, but also a big part will be education. Like you said, if the government isn't really taking charge on climate change, then the people aren't going to either. They're not going to make it a priority. And so I think having the government educate more people, and obviously news sources and stuff, because things can be biased, but just more education and more awareness that it is real and that it is a big problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the government definitely needs to play more of a role in bringing about a completely carbon neutral economy and slowing climate change. Because at the end of the day, climate change is a very serious problem, and it's a matter of fact and science, not just a matter of opinion. Believing that climate change doesn't exist or believing that it's not a serious threat is not going to make it go away. So our government, first of all, needs to be taking a lot of action to guide the market towards a carbon neutral economy, and also a lot more effort towards recognizing that this is a crisis and educating people. So I think one of the biggest examples of how they could do that is including climate change as accepted in curriculum in all public schools. That's a big first step in making this accepted knowledge as scientific fact.
I would say that the government can play a role in this, again, like what both of you guys said, in educating, but I would say educating rather than regulating, including, taking time to create informational campaigns to send out to voters to say, this is my stance on the environment, and this is backed up by science and such. And I also think that voters should be demanding that their politicians are responsive to what they want and not just letting them, get by on incorrect facts and not doing enough for the environment if that's what they want.
Yeah, one way in which we do see the obvious trade-off between the economy and the environment, I would say, has come with the coronavirus and the COVID-19. Thinking about manufacturing has been limited. Air traffic, airplane traffic has gone down considerably, and so the emissions, since the world has experienced this economic downturn, has had, for some environmentalists, it's had positive effects just in terms of limiting the amount of emissions and contributions. I'm not sure how much any of you have prepared for a question kind of like this, but it seems that we see other actors stepping up to a certain extent as they see the central government, the federal government, maybe not doing enough in their eyes. And I'm thinking particularly of states, and particularly the state of California, and other states as well, but that whether it's in response to the Paris the climate change withdrawal, the decision to pull the U.S. out of that, where states and municipalities and companies, even corporations were saying, had a major campaign, we're still in. You know, so yes, the federal government has decided to pull out, but the rest of us, or many of us, at the state level, city level, other places are still wanting to have that cooperative multilateral approach. And it's interesting that it's at a nation state level. I don't know if anybody wanted to comment on that.
I don't know much about specific policies in terms of states, but I do know that the environment is a big part of politics in Michigan specifically. Our Great Lakes, that's a major platform a lot of politicians run on, is protecting them. And I know, like, I've seen a couple of, like, Gary Peters ads, and he talks about, you know, that being one of his greatest priorities and stuff. So I think in Michigan specifically, that is a big deal, trying to balance out, like, the manufacturing of, like, Detroit and that sort of thing with our beautiful environment and trying to keep that safe with, like, all the, like, conflict with pipelines and that sort of thing that's been a big deal. So I do think at the state level, I agree that there's been probably in some states more movement towards environmental sustainability.
Yeah, I would say that the coronavirus has shown a great example of how local communities are best suited to protect their environments. There's a great example out of Arizona. When wildfires devastated federally owned forests, it left the nearby San Carlos Indian Reservation unscathed. Despite having identical weather conditions and similar environments, the fire left the reservation mostly untouched. This is due to the fact that folks on the reservation took management steps to mitigate fire risks, but the federal government didn't have the local knowledge to protect the environment. Another thing that I think is great on the state level is you can see that funding of conservation comes particularly from hunters and anglers funding all that through licensing fees, and that's a great way to show that the federal government isn't needed to protect the environment within the state.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's great that it's really inspiring to see the ways that states are stepping up to deal with the climate crisis and other environmental issues. But it's very unfortunate that our federal government also isn't on board. Of course, local communities are going to have the best knowledge of how to help themselves, and states are going to know best how to help themselves. But that's not good. It'll be way more effective when the federal government is working with them and supporting their efforts, rather than the current state that the federal government is in, where it's denying the crisis and working against any efforts to slow climate change.
All right, thank you all for that. I'm going to move on here to a question about the Green New Deal. The prepared question was, I'll just read it here. What are your impressions, thoughts, reservations about the Green New Deal?
Okay, I'll go first. Having read through the House resolution on a Green New Deal, it looks very promising to me. An important note is that it isn't the original resolution, as authored by Representatives Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ed Markey, is not a specific policy, but rather a resolution. So the House of Representatives is setting a goal for itself to pass climate legislation with the long-term goal of making our economy completely carbon neutral by the year 2050. And the way that they're planning to do this is through massive investments in a green economy, everything from public transit in cities to high-speed rail replacing air travel and clean energy to replace fossil fuels on our grid. And what I like about these proposals is that it's all using the technology of today. We have the means right now to achieve a green economy, and the question now is implementation. How do we incorporate all of these technologies into our economy as fast as possible to stop the climate crisis? And unfortunately, the resolution did not pass the House. And I think that's because there's a really unfortunate dichotomy between preserving jobs in the fossil fuel industry and preserving a healthy environment. We can preserve both jobs and climate, and that's the second goal of this Green New Deal resolution, was in the process of converting our economy to green energy to create millions of good-paying jobs in the process in manufacturing and construction. And not only will these be good-paying jobs, but they'll be jobs with union representation so that these workers have a say in their wages and in their working conditions to create really sustainable economic growth, both in an environmental sense and in an economic sense.
Yeah, I also read through the Green New Deal, and I liked how it kind of acknowledged the injustices that climate change can cause within different communities, and how they also acknowledged, they said that any policies or anything that would affect indigenous people, that they would get the consent of indigenous people first, and I thought that was really cool. I do have some reservations with the Green New Deal. I think it's good in theory, but I don't think it's substantial enough. I think that's part of why it didn't pass, is because it was more just an abstract, and like it didn't have details about how it would like increase wages and increase jobs and that sort of thing. So I think it just kind of lacked the substance that it needed to really persuade people. But obviously it was kind of like a broad thing, and other policies are probably going to try to play into that in the future.
I would say the Green New Deal could be applauded for inspiring many to action. However, I would say that for the most part, it's economically unrealistic. The plan talks of a $93 trillion price tag, and this is a cost that most Americans aren't willing to bear. The Green New Deal would stray from a free market towards a centrally planned economy, resulting in higher taxes, less individual choice, and an increased resilience on a government who has proven to be ineffective at handling environmental issues. We see that the free market is an excellent place for solutions to climate issues to be found. In fact, most sources of renewable energy were created or made effective in the free market through private research and development. There's little room for innovation when everything is dictated by the federal government, and this has lots of unintended consequences, such as policies limiting coal, oil, and natural gas production in the US won't actually stop global consumption. Companies that are producing wind, solar, and battery energy also produce waste streams and have to dispose of these products, which are actually toxic and expensive to dispose of. And as you both noted, high energy costs do disproportionately hurt the poor, who have to make the decision between heating their homes and feeding their families when energy costs rise.
Yeah, I want to echo some of the comments there about from all the panelists about the overarching nature of the Green New Deal. It's not simply about the environment, but in many ways about correcting injustices, whether they be racially oriented or just economic inequality. Liam talked about the intention of trying to increase union membership, or at least possibilities there. But yeah, it kind of restructures not just environmental policy, but as a plan to restructure major aspects of the U.S. Economy. So to move on a bit, I wanted to get to a question about personal responsibility, maybe. Instead of, the last question on our list that we were provided says, this is a really important election that we are experiencing. It's ongoing. What is one piece of encouragement you would like to pass on to your peers about the importance of voting?
I'll go first. So I'd just like to say unequivocally that your vote matters. To everyone listening to this, your vote matters. In democracy, we the people guide our government because the government governs with the consent of the governed. And voting is our collective responsibility to guide our leaders towards how we want our world to be. And in a society where we're all equal, we all share the same responsibility. And none of us can afford not to be involved in politics. I know it's unfortunately common for people to just not participate because it's seen as something irrelevant to them, but that's just not the case. It's not like professional sports. You don't just not follow it. It's something that affects all of us.
I pretty much agree with everything Liam just said. And I also think that us as young people, the policies that are being implemented are our future. And we can't just sit back and let the older generations pretty much guide what our future will look like in terms of policy. And so I think we need to have our voices be heard and work together with the older generations to make sure our future is secure and our future is prosperous.
My piece of advice would be that informed voting is important, and this includes being informed on the side that you're voting against. Do your own research from reputable sources. Don't take your information from Instagram slides, please. Look at the candidates' track records, and don't change your vote just because someone said you should. I'd also like to note that there's bound to be disappointment after the election, but a verse that brings me comfort is Daniel 2:21 that says, God controls human events. He gives rulers power and takes it away. He is the source of wisdom and knowledge.
And to add to that a bit, it's the decision for whom to vote is made more difficult by the fact that the environment or environmental issues, climate issues, are not the only issues that we're considering. So, we might be in a position where we agree maybe with one candidate or party on environmental issues, but when it comes perhaps to issues maybe of abortion or broader foreign policy issues or other important issues, and then how do we weigh these things and how do we decide when if the picture is not necessarily so simple where, I agree pretty much 100% with this candidate or with this group or this party and not at all with the others, but when we have to kind of weigh what is more important to our voting decision, it makes it even more difficult. And I want to follow up on the question of personal responsibility in terms of participating in the political process, how important the vote is. I think, we're going to, as I suggested before, I think we are going to see perhaps even record high turnout levels. So that's one really good thing I think that has come out of this rancorous, polarized, sometimes just flat out awful period of politics. One positive is that people are engaging and do seem to be participating, seem to be waiting in line for hours to vote and saying, this is important, I'm not going to let this opportunity pass. But I wanted to kind of push the idea or the notion of personal responsibility in a little bit different direction. When it comes to environmental sustainability in climate change, what personal responsibilities do you think we have, or maybe do you personally believe that you have when it comes to our consumption choices? Do we, how often do we get in an airplane? Not too much these days, of course, but what kinds of cars do we drive? What about our diet? What do we, not necessarily for whom do we vote, but how do we live our lives in a way that is conscious of the environment and of the planet that we share with some 7 billion other people? And how do you think through those questions?
Okay. Well, yeah, like I said before, we have a collective responsibility to vote, and we also have a collective responsibility to take care of the earth as humans and especially as Christians. Now, we all have what's known as an ecological footprint, which is the number of, how many resources we consume and how much pollution we emit. And it's expressed as a number of Earths, so if everyone lived the same lifestyle as you, how many Earths would it take to supply the resources you consume or to absorb the pollution that you emit? And the figure for the US is 5. If everyone emitted the same amount of carbon pollution we did, it would take 5 Earths to process that amount of carbon. So we all have a responsibility to reduce our carbon footprint, and we can do that in so many different ways, like starting with not driving as much, instead using public transit, walking or biking, using less electricity, just turning the lights off when you leave a room. It's such an over-repeated line, but it's so important to not waste energy. Also, even with the things we eat, like eating meat products, the production of meat produces so much more carbon than a plant-based diet, and it's also a lot less healthy for us. That's a big way you can reduce your carbon footprint as well.
I am very passionate about reducing fast fashion. That's a huge polluter in all areas, with the manufacturing polluting the air. Clothes are often produced with microplastics that can get into the water and that sort of thing, artificial dyes, all that sort of stuff. And there are a lot of businesses out there now that produce affordable, sustainable clothing. And I think it's really important to not just go to the mall and take the easy way out and get that $10 shirt from Target, or you could be getting a shirt probably around the same price that's made of organic, sustainable cotton, but you'd probably just have to find it online or that sort of thing. And then one of the best options is also going to thrift stores and reusing clothes and that sort of thing. Because then those won't end up in landfills and in the water and polluting lots of other places. So I just think that's something more people have to pay attention to.
I would agree, and this goes off the phrase, vote with your dollar. Support companies that produce goods in a sustainable way. Support farms who raise their animals in more sustainable ways than factory farming. With my own family farm, we feed our cows dispense brewer's grain, so the byproduct of creating beer, and that's, not letting that go to waste. I hunt for my own food. But yeah, just being mindful of where you spend your money and supporting companies whose values you agree with.
Great, thank you. And Megan, you'll be happy to know my shirt and my pants came from Goodwill. So
Okay.
that might be a cost factor, and rather than an ethical responsibility. But
With thrift shopping, it often works both ways. It's often cheaper than shopping at Target or something, and more environmentally friendly if you don't want to go the just new sustainable clothing route, which is possible to be more expensive.
So we have just a few minutes left here, and I don't know, you have all prepared some comments and responses, so I wanted to make sure that you got a chance to go through the material that you had prepared. And so I'll just leave it open-ended. I have another specific question if we get to that. But just if there's anything you wanted to make sure you said or got in.
Oh, I forgot one thing about the Green New Deal that I wanted to mention. I didn't think it talked enough about different kinds of pollutants. It talked a lot about greenhouse gases and that sort of thing. I haven't really heard enough conversation about what plastic is doing to the environment. I know there's research being conducted overseas. I think I read an article about Great Britain and I think Japan, where they've created scientific ways to break down and kind of reverse the chemical compounds that make up plastic. And so I think those are good steps that are being taken, but I don't think, plastic is everywhere, and I don't think, the Green New Deal doesn't seem to, address that. So that was a problem I had with it.
Okay,
Liam, anything else that you'd like to share?
Not specifically that I included in my material, no.
Thank you.
I think
Gretel?
I've got through everything.
Okay. Follow on Megan's point. My daughter is majoring in environmental engineering currently and has educated me to a certain extent about several issues. And so I've made an effort to try to purchase at the grocery store more products that come in glass rather than plastic. And it's difficult. In many cases, there's not an option. I mean, if you're going to buy this, a certain flavor of salad dressing or whatever it may be, that there are not always that many options. But that's another example of what Gretel was saying too, is that that manufacturers, producers will follow the tastes or the preferences of consumers, and that is at least one area that seems that where there's a win-win. Sarah, I don't know if you had closing thoughts or closing comments, but I had one. I want to put my 2 cents in a little bit more, and I'm thinking about the costs of these programs. So, for example, former Vice President Biden his plan, maybe it would be more expensive, but the plan is to spend $2 trillion over 4 years. And that is fairly expensive. But when we put that in the context of the defense budget or the national security budget altogether, which defense is about $700 billion per year, and national security, more broadly defined to include intelligence and other issues, other budgets, is 1.2, 0.5 trillion, depending on how you add it, how you do the math, but well over $1 trillion per year. So I wonder if American voters if the pitch was not to, hey, save the owls or save the polar bears, but if the pitch were more, hey, this is in the U.S. national security interests, whether you figure it with preventing resource scarcity overseas that then result in war, that then the U.S. feels compelled to intervene, or whether it's the health or just economic costs on the United States. I wonder if there's a better way or a way to frame the issue in a national security lens, or through that lens, that would maybe, most of us are plenty willing to spend the big bucks when it comes to national security. That might be an option. I don't know if in the last minute, if anyone wants to respond to that.
Yeah, I'd like to. As I said before, climate change, it's an existential threat facing humanity, and it's on par with, if not greater than, any threat posed by a foreign country. So I think if we look at it in terms of national security, it'll definitely seem more worth the cost, because it is, considering the threat it poses, and also considering how overinflated our military budget is, if I might describe it as that, compared to the amount that our government is currently spending, or even the amount that Joe Biden has proposed we spend on it.
We're good?
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay. Gretel? Yeah? All right. Well, thank you very much, Sarah and Zach and Green Hope. And I'll echo what all these folks have said. Vote.
Well, I certainly learned something, and I hope all of you did too. I just want to finish the evening off with thanking all of our student panelists behind me. Thank you, Gretel, Megan, and Liam, for joining us tonight and offering and sharing your voices, and for showing all of us exactly what our college has been hoping for, showing us how we can engage in discourse with love, dignity, and respect. And also for sharing your views on sustainability, because I think it is at the heart of our generation as we enter, well, we are very much in the midst of this election, as Dr. Toppin has so clearly stated tonight. And as I've said that, thank you, Dr. Toppin, for joining us tonight. We very much appreciate your wisdom and educating us on sustainable politics, because the Green New Deal and everything sustainable politics can be very confusing. So we appreciate it and your wise words. And with that, we wish you all a good evening, and thank you for joining us. Good night.